over the last 6 months, I've gotten a lot of comments from people that want to buy a retro handheld from the last generation, but they're unsure of which to pick. Today, we're going to be covering my favorite handheld from the end of Gen 1, the RG300 version 3. The RG300 is powered by a JZ4760B, which is the best MIPS processor in this generation, running between 600 and 700 MHz. The board includes 128 megabytes of RAM, 16 gigabytes of internal SD card storage with an additional 32 gigabytes in a secondary slot, and a 1800 mAh battery. The final thing here, and arguably the most important, is the 3-inch IPS display. I've seen all kinds of wildly incorrect figures about the resolution of this display here on YouTube and on online stores. Even the box that this comes in has the wrong resolution for this device. The RG300 has a resolution of 320 by 480. There are currently 3 devices with this form factor from the previous generation that you can see on screen right now, with the RG300 and the LDK being the better of the 3. The IPS screen is essentially the only reason why I would even consider buying this device in the first place. Version 3 of the RG300 came out in the summer, and I've actually owned it the entire time, but I also got an RG350 at the same time, and we all know what happened with that device. The screen that was added to this version is the exact same panel that's found in the RS97, and it's one of the better panels out there, and it's one of the few IPS screens that you can find in these 600 MHz handhelds. Among other things, using an IPS panel in a handheld means that you're going to be getting exceptional viewing angles and picture quality, and while you won't really be viewing this from anything except dead on, it is nice to have the option. On top of this, this device doesn't have any light leaks around the perimeter of the screen, even though my version is using the translucent case. You have 2 hardware keys underneath the screen. The first one cycles the brightness values on the display, and the second one is used to call up a menu inside of emulators for a good portion of the ones that ship with this device. The D-pad on the 300 isn't anything special, and in fact, it's probably indistinguishable from the 350 since these devices are known to share component suppliers. I would say that it's rigid with a decent amount of travel, and it's comfortable to use in longer gaming sessions. The start and select keys are found right next to the D-pad, and there isn't anything special to mention here except for the fact that they do work well. The final keys on the front are the ABXY buttons, and these are significant for several reasons, first of which is the fact that they are translucent. Most of the handhelds from this generation and the next feature buttons that are either solid black or multicolored to match the SNES aesthetic. These buttons have a very slight rounded top to them, and while they are fairly exceptional keys for input, I'm not a fan of translucent keys on this device or any for that matter. Finally, the mono speaker is located on the right palm rest. The speaker on the 300 is middle of the road in terms of quality, but it does get the job done for the systems that I would run on this device. I also like that you have the ability to control the volume with a nice slider on the right side of the unit. The following is a mic'd up recording of the speaker at half volume. Now let's finish up the rest of the device. On the left side, you will find the power switch and secondary SD card slot. You can access the internal SD card by taking off the battery cover, and while you can run ROMs off the internal SD card if you wanted to, I always encourage people to put their ROMs on this secondary slot for better portability. Besides the form factor, the other major selling point of this handheld is the fact that it includes shoulder buttons on the back of the device. These use Omron switches, which are the same ones that are found in gaming mice, and they are very good trigger keys. The only downside to this implementation is the fact that the ledge that the switch sits on is a little short. When you're holding the device firmly in hand, you'll notice right away that half or more of your fingers hanging off the edge, and it does take a little to get used to. You also don't have access to L2 or R2 with this handheld, but the chip in this little guy is not powerful enough to run the games that make use of those buttons, so it isn't a big deal. This brings us to the bottom of the device, which you will see includes an AV and USB Type-C port. This handheld is one of a very small group in this generation that even bothered to use this updated port. It's also important to note that this device comes with AV cables, which historically hasn't meant much. The latest firmware that I'm featuring in this review actually does a good job of making that port usable for those that would want to hook this up to a TV. It's important to note that when you use this port, you will be taking a little bit of processing power to output the signal to a TV. That means you'll want to stay away from trying to run systems that run close to the limit of this device in this way. That being said, this is a great option to run any retro system that has a good amount of headroom on top with room to spare for outputting the signal over the AV cables, as you can see from several examples on screen now. The rest of this review is going to focus specifically on the software and what it can do. I want to mention really quickly that I'm using a beta build of RetroFW version 2.1 for this review, which is miles better than what this device ships with. What you see here is essentially the vanilla build of this firmware after installing all of the available software packs on a freshly formatted SD card. There isn't really anything important to mention here in terms of the look and feel of the system, but I will say that if you're familiar with some themes on these systems, you won't find them on this handheld at the present time. You can customize the way that this device looks by going into the settings menu, and I will be doing that for the rest of this review. Version 2.1 of this firmware supports a big list of emulators, and on screen you can see what I found to run well. I consider a system to run well if it runs at or very near 60 FPS without any frame skip enabled. Neo Geo, PS1, and Super Nintendo will all require some form of frame skip in order to run on the chipset used in this device, so this isn't the handheld for you if you want to play games from those systems specifically. One of the main reasons why I even use this device at all is to play GB and GBC games. The best part of the GB emulator on the RG300 is that it supports custom color palettes that you can apply to change the look and feel of old GB games. I've already gone ahead and adapted a bunch of these that I found online to work with this device specifically for this review, and they do work well. You can, for example, apply Super Game Boy color palettes to make Game Boy games look exactly like they would if you were running the game on that hardware. There are numerous ones of these, and you can change them on the fly, so you're bound to find one that will work well for you, especially if you have a big history with these old GB games. There are only 2 devices on the market right now that use this Game Boy Pocket form factor that I absolutely love, and this is the better of the 2. I think it's really a shame that so few of these vertical designs were ever implemented because the market is really saturated right now with landscape devices. GBC will also run without any issues, and I've already put in a ton of time on this device playing Pokemon Red++ with no issues. If you want to run something a little more modern, the 300 is also capable of running a majority of the GBA library without frame skip if you customize some settings. You won't be able to run more demanding games like Doom and Duke Nukem, but virtually anything that you pick will run at full speed with no dips and no screen tearing. This obviously also isn't the best option, but for Super Nintendo games that don't run well on this device without frame skip enabled, their GBA counterparts run flawlessly, so this is at least an option to consider if you don't mind using ports. My second use case for this device is to play Sega CD games. The 32GB card that comes with this is really big enough to hold full ROM sets of everything that runs well, and since PS1 is a little bit of a reach for this chip, you can dedicate a few gigabytes on the card to hold a ton of Sega CD games that will run without any issues on the RG300. Now, I want to talk about the 2 big systems that require some work to run well on this device. As you can see on screen, the base frequency that the emulators are configured at is 600 MHz. The biggest thing that I never see anyone mention when they review these devices here on YouTube is the fact that you can overclock each and every emulator on here to help increase performance. For PlayStation and Super Nintendo, 600 MHz just isn't fast enough to emulate games at full speed with the chipset and software that we currently have. Using Donkey Kong 1 at the base frequency, you can see that the FPS on screen is well below the limit and the game is absolutely chugging. We could make this a little more playable if we enabled frame skip, but even with that option enabled, the game becomes super choppy and very unpleasant to play. We can attempt to improve this situation by playing with what I call the overclock lottery. You can access the settings menu for any emulator on the main screen, and there you will find the CPU clock number. You'll need to do a little trial and error here to find an overclock that runs stable on your device, but I've already gone ahead and found that a stable overclock of 690 runs with no issues on my unit. If we head back into DK1 with this new overclock, you will see that the FPS has dramatically improved to the point where the game is almost running at full speed. Following the same process as before, a frame skip of at least 1 makes this much better. Other games for this system are pretty much the same in terms of performance, with only the FX games being really out of reach in terms of playability on this handheld. That leaves us with PlayStation 1, except for the fact that there are more speed hacks that you can use to increase performance if you're okay with sacrificing things like shadows to get games to run better. As you already saw, games with pre-rendered backgrounds like Final Fantasy VII can run on this device without issues. It is going to be a bit of give and take for the rest of the PlayStation 1 library at this point until we get more aggressive software improvements for this chipset. As it currently stands, I would definitely not pick up this device for PlayStation 1 at all, and would only consider the fact that it's remotely capable of running on the system as a bonus. Anyway, that's it for my review of the RG300 version 3 and a little showcase of the newest RetroFW version 2.1 build. Like I said, this is my favorite device from the last generation, but it is a little pricey. I personally would advise anyone to buy a Gen 1 device for over $40 because there are too many good options out there for just a little more money. I am hoping that the price of this little guy goes down as the company that makes it comes out with an updated model in this form factor later in the year. Anyways, I want to say thank you for watching the review, and if you like what you saw, consider leaving a like below and subscribe for future videos. I'll catch you here next time with another review. Now go out and enjoy the rest of your day. Taki out.